about Mapungubwe and the Swahili. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I mean, the distance between the coast and Great Zimbabwe is nearly 400 kilometers, so not very far. If you're walking across from Kilwa to Great Zimbabwe, and you're covering 100 kilometers every 5 days, you'll be able to make it there in less than a month. Right? At least 20 days you are actually in Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, which makes it an interesting way of looking at how could this have been going on. We know that Great Zimbabwe has especially been very controversial. The place of Mapungubwe and Babanyalo, Great Zimbabwe, in African history has been every bit as controversial as the relationship that West African states had with North Africa, where the argument was maybe Arabs came from the north. For Great Zimbabwe, it was anybody. It was one of those lost kingdoms. And so it was extremely controversial. But we do know from the work that has been done, especially after the 80s, primarily by African colleagues, like Innocent Pikirai, like Chapurukha Chilikure, who are now teaching in universities in South Africa, that the developments that were going on in the Zimbabwe plateau were very much closely tied to what was going on in East Africa. In other words, African people knew of each other. They are working with each other, interacting with each other through trade and other means. And so, as the east coast of Africa is becoming more and more urbanized, we see these changes also occurring in the interior. The rise of Mapungubwe is very much allied to the rise of Kilwa. And as Mapungubwe declines, the Great Zimbabwe emerges, but we also see the emergence of a lot of this politics. Just like today, Kilwa was a primary port linking Africa to Asia. Today, you have Durban, you have Dar es Salaam, you have Mombasa, you have all of these ports that are linking Africa to the rest of the world. Kilwa was the gateway of Southern Africa. You have Mombasa, Zanzibar, Lamu, but many of these ports going up that are linking East Africa, the East African interior, to the rest, to the outside world. And so you cannot look at the history and the developments of Southeast Africa without looking at how they are related to East Africa as such. So they are all completely tied together.
In fact, one of the things I plan to do in the future, maybe within the next 2 years, is actually to go to Zimbabwe in the border, the border terrain with South Africa, and sort of look at some of these artifacts and what has been done and look around. I'm told that they have a fantastic museum there right now.
They have a fantastic museum in Masvingo.
Right,
right.
Yeah.
Because the entire, in fact, Great Zimbabwe is a museum. And they have a really, really good museum at Masvingo, and I will very strongly encourage you to go there. But when you're there, you can talk to the curator there, Edward Matenga, who's doing some really good work. And you could also go to University of Cape Town.
Right. Well, I went to University of Pretoria, and I looked at the museum and the Mapungubwe artifacts. In fact, that is what encouraged me to decide, well, hey, I better go further north. Well, not this. Well, I don't know if you call it the source, but at least where there's a great deal of action. You know.
Well, Innocent Pikirai is at University of Pretoria.
Oh, I see.
And he's actually the chairman of the department there.
Okay.
And so next time you are there, you can actually talk to Innocent Pikirai, because Innocent Pikirai has most recently been looking at developments that occur after the fall of when Zimbabwe declines, and then you have developments that are going on. And Innocent has also worked on the Swahili coast.
Right. Oh, this
so
is
he's
excellent.
been moving back and forth.
Yes.
There's also Gilbert Pwiti. So when you are in Zimbabwe, speak with Gilbert Pwiti, who has written a very, very persuasive paper on the relationship between Great Zimbabwe and the Swahili.
And the Swahili, okay, excellent.
And Shadrach Pikirai, Shadrach Chirikure is at University of Cape Town, and has now been looking at even more interesting developments, which is indigenous developments in tin mining in South Africa. Because you know the assumption always was that it was whites who started mining tin because Africans did not do it. But I think what Shadrach and his students, one who just recently defended his dissertation in excavating some of the tin mines that are indigenous.
Right.
Surprisingly, what used to happen is that whenever the tin mines and many of the geologists who worked there found evidence of indigenous tin mining, they'll always say, well, maybe some Arabs came and were doing, but I think...
I know.
There is actually a where they supposedly found bodies of, or remains of 3 Arab people at these tin mines or in the vicinity, and those bodies were never found. So it was all made up. They just vanished from the face of the earth.
Yeah.
So, but the foreman, there's a gentleman called, a recent PhD called Foreman Band, I think, who's just finished his PhD on tin mining.
Okay.
I think his work is particularly illuminating in showing that it's just innovation is a human element, but it cannot be confined to any one particular group. And anytime someone begins to say this came before this, then you have to, especially in today's world, you really have to question what their motivation is.
So we've talked a bit about iron, we've talked about tin mining, and I guess we should make some comments about gold.
Yeah. Well, gold was one of the primary exports from Africa to the outside world. And so, in fact, Zimbabwe, one of the Kilwa, was the major port for exporting African gold to Asia. And most of this gold is throughout its history, in fact, coming from South Central Africa, Zimbabwe. So that's there. I think that gold is known and it's never been questioned. Gold mining, indigenous gold mining, is acknowledged by everyone. It is tin
that is the troublesome.
That has been, that was for a long time. Now we know that these guys are exporting everything. And no matter, there's been always an attempt to say Africans could do this. Well, they could do iron, but they couldn't do gold. But now they could do gold, they couldn't do tin. But now we want to do tin, aluminum, But so everything has been there. But have you found any? I mean, if you look at many of these arguments, they changed generationally. There was a time when African Americans were sprinters in this country, a lot of the experts essentially said Africans can only sprint, but they could not run long races.
Right.
Then came East Africans from Ethiopia, from Kenya, Tanzania,
The marathoners.
And now it's sort of we don't hear that argument anymore. But in fact, in many ways, and whenever a door has been opened and things become much more, I guess, when the playing field is much more level, we found that African and any other peoples around the world are quite capable of doing everything that anybody else can do.
Well, I recall reading your text on the Swahili, one of the best works, I think, on Swahili civilization, and that attracted me a great deal. Can you comment a bit about your work related to this area?
Yeah, for nearly 3 decades I've been doing anthropological research on the Kenyan coast. 3,000 kilometers from southern Somalia to northern Mozambique. These communities essentially speak one language, different dialects across, and this language is Kiswahili. Is essentially confined along the coast. Right? The reason why you have this similarity in the language that's so widespread and spoken by people over a 3,000 kilometer stretch of land is primarily because of ease of travel between those communities, and they moved around because they made and used 5 different kinds of sailing and fishing vessels. Sailing technology among the coastal peoples of East Africa was very, very sophisticated.
What's the difference between one and the other?
The size, usage, and specialization. You have boats, you have basically dugouts that are being used primarily ashore for fishing, but then you have Daulam tepe that are slightly bigger, that are used for offshore fishing, but also sailing from one island to another. You have some slightly bigger ones that are being used for transportation, particularly moving goods from the mangrove into the town. And then you have large dhows. It's known for advances that it made, particularly in building technology. The evolution is widely known, but it's not so much known among non-Africans who have always believed that the rise of civilization is often associated with other peoples around the world other than Africans. And so, for the most part, whenever built-up environments that look like cities around the world were found in Africa, they often were attributed or credited to peoples rather than African themselves who actually lived in these places. Well, East Africa is a very interesting place because some of the oldest peoples around the world emerged in East Africa. You see the development of mosaics of communities living and trading and intermarrying with each other. And you can move this back in time as far as the late Pleistocene. On the Kenyan coast, on the other hand, beginning from at least the early 1st century AD, you begin to see certain transformations in the landscape, where you begin to see the development of large-scale villages that very quickly transform into essentially urbanized polities.
How many city-states are we talking about?
We're talking about tens of them. They are most often confined to the coast. their lifestyle is both terrestrial as well as maritime, in the sense that they're exploiting the sea resources and also the terrestrial resources equally. Some of they're also living in the island communities, and because they are living on some of the islands within the Indian Ocean, their size will be dictated by, in fact, the size of the islands that they are occupying. And so these communities are primarily maritime in nature. They are, beginning from the time we encounter them, they are exploiting all of the sea resources and the coastal offshore resources basically equally. But they are also engaged in trade with the hinterland communities. By the 9th century, these communities enter into much more regular interaction with peoples from outside Africa, as well as even South Asia. So this is during the time of the rise of Islam.
Now, I remember being told that a great deal of porcelain has been found, in certain parts of the area, suggesting Chinese, trade.
Yeah, porcelain has been very useful for, in fact, determining the dates of these cities, and also the nature of trade and places that East Africans are interacting with. So, for example, based on just the porcelain findings, the trade ceramic findings, we know that East Africans are engaged in maritime trade, Persian Gulf, with South Asia, and in fact with East Asia, primarily China in the early stages, and then later even with Japan in the later stages of pre-colonial East Africa.
What did they import from Japan?
There is a particular ware that is imported from Japan from the 18th through the 19th century, called karatsu ware, that we find in settlements like Mombasa and even Tuapa. This is during the time when the Portuguese are in the region. But before that, you have primarily Persian, South Asian, mostly India, Pakistani. My doctoral work focused on history of technology, where I excavated a series of iron production sites on the east coast of Africa. One of the reasons why I was doing this was I really wanted to understand the role of iron in the development of complex societies in Africa. And of course, these polities occur or develop during the later Iron Age period in East Africa. There are citations or references to the complexity of iron working in East Africa. In fact, Arab geographers like Al-Masud discuss the sophisticated iron being made in East Africa. But they do so by citing Asian mariners who are coming to East Africa and how they, in fact, compared the quality of iron made in East Africa with their own. At the time, we know that Asians are producing some of the finest high-quality iron known as crucible steel. Schmidt at University of Florida has been doing research in East Africa since the late 60s. And it is largely through his research in Western Tanzania and Uganda that he was actually able to demonstrate the sophistication and the complexity of iron production in East Africa and Africa essentially as a whole. He was able to show, both through metallographic analysis of the artifacts, but also through working with the then surviving iron workers. Africans were able to manufacture iron or steel. The reasons why the Indians would import steel from East Africa. And the reason is that if you look at the Deccan Plateau, where a lot of this iron was actually being manufactured, it had by that time become heavily deforested. Much of Gujarat and Maharashtra was essentially agricultural land. So there was shortage of, in fact, fuel in India. And it just makes sense that it's actually cheaper from the point of view of a merchant to import iron from East Africa, because the entire, demographically speaking, East Africa is still very lowly populated at this time. Ivory, spices, perfumes like myrrh that are coming from the land of Punt and frankincense, and there are minerals that are coming, gold that is coming from the Zimbabwe plateau, and many other things, including, in fact, iron. In fact, qualitatively, it is not even 500 years earlier, Al-Masud had in fact commented on the quality of iron that was being made in Malindi, and this was when Duarte Barbosa comes there.
Well, on this note, I want to thank you so much for allowing me to, have this very exciting discussion. And I do hope that we could follow this up another time, in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gloria. It was nice to meet you too. I'm a big fan of your work.
Oh, thank you.
I really like what you are doing too, not just in terms of your own research, but also popularizing and making some of the work that we do become available to the general American and international